Welcome to iLearn virtual conference, our 7th annual conference. We're pleased to welcome Dylan Paré to the stage on designing queer technologies. This is a featured event. We're really excited about this. Dylan, whenever you're ready to go, we're ready to hear you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm not sure quite where to stand. I guess at the podium. Yeah. Let's try that. So thank you all for coming here today. And I have a prepared presentation, but I'm hoping to really engage with you at the end of this with any of your questions that you might have for me and your own ideas and experiences. So the title of this talk is Designing Queer Technologies, a Critical Phenomenological Reorientation of Immersive and Interactive Learning. My name is Dylan Paré, and I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the Learning Sciences at the University of Calgary in the Werklund School of Education. I'm also the director of the Queer Code Collective, and I'll speak a little bit more to those as we go forward. And I just want to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I'm presenting from Mohkinstsis. It's on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And I acknowledge that Mohkinstsis is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I encourage you all to also look up what land you're on and to reflect on what that means for our relations to the land and to other people and to the original peoples. Next. Nope. Why is it not advancing? There we go. So as I said, I'm a PhD candidate. I also studied gender and sexuality and social change at the undergraduate and master's levels. And I worked as an educator in gender and sexual diversity and inclusion in post-secondary workplace and community settings for a number of years. I'm the director of the Queer Code Collective, which I have up on this side over here. This is the website. You can check it out at queercode.org. And we're a design and research-based collective that designs, develops, and researches digital technologies and experience and interactive art and storytelling with queer and trans experiences at the forefront. So I design virtual, immersive, and interactive computational environments for learning about complex systems, computational thinking, and technology design. And my primary research project reimagines computational and technoscientific literacies by interweaving complexity studies in education, the scholarship on embodiment and virtual projection, as well as queer and trans phenomenology. So why queer technologies, and how did I get here? So in 2016, I started my PhD in education because I wanted to improve how we do education about queer and trans issues. As an educator for a number of years, I did many sessions I was requested to do on LGBTQ 101 terminology. And what I found was that it's pretty ineffective for developing deeper understanding and caring relationships. And so I wanted to figure out how could we do better. And then in my first year, after my first year of my PhD, I got to try VR. And this is a picture of me the first time that I tried VR at a public installation at Microsoft Store. And I mean, I was just blown away. I'm sure many of you have the same kinds of experiences the first time you tried VR. But for me, I became interested in how we can design technologies for deeper and more meaningful learning about queer and trans experiences. So this set off the next 4 years of no sleep or lots of work on different projects across VR and other sorts of digital technologies. So these are the projects that I'm going to go over today and tell you a little bit about what I learned from each of these. This is some of my recent publications, and I don't expect you to be able to read those, but you can go to the Queer Code website under research to access these publications. And I try to make either preprints or other forms of my publications available to everybody. I think that, you know, education and research should be public for everyone to benefit from. And so you can check those out there. And I'm kind of going to be talking a little bit about the knowledge that I gained and talked about in those publications throughout. Oh, I lost my presenter controls. How do I get those back? Oh, I remember. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. So what I found is that largely the focus of existing workshops are in the LGBTQ community focus on conceptual learning. And I want to say that labels do serve a purpose for finding community, organizing for political rights, and terms are always shifting as people develop ways to try to communicate their experiences. However, labels and concepts are an abstraction of experience, so they never fully capture the fundamental experience itself. So, for example, knowing how to define transgender and how to categorize a person does not move us to understand trans experiences. And I use move us in both the sort of emotional sense and as well as the cognitive sense of moving us towards understanding experience. So I'm asking the questions, what are the experiences of being, you know, transgender, of being queer, of being non-normative, however that's sort of experienced and understood. And how can a better understanding of the multitude of these experiences expand our individual and collective understandings of gender and sexuality? Because gender and sexuality is something that we all have, we all experience, and we're all in conversation with societal norms. So a phenomenological approach to learning moves from a focus on a conceptual approach to learning to a more complex form of experience. And then building on the phenomenological, a critical phenomenological approach centers marginalized experiences of oppression, restraint, erasure, and silencing by normative and disciplinary forces. It analyzes how systems of domination and liberation occur through relationships between objects, people, and their environments, and how these systems of power multiply in effect when people are situated at multiple axes of oppression. So when you are non-normative according to your gender and your sexuality, in addition to oppression, axes of oppression regarding race and disability and other sorts of identities and experiences. So in addition to this, a critical phenomenological approach also centers marginalized experiences of joy, desire, expression, love, community, intimacy, imagination, future world building, and resistance and survival under normative oppressive forces. So I want to emphasize that it's not just sort of the sad stuff, it's also the joyful part of it as well. So why look at technology, and why does this matter to experiences of personal identity and oppressions? Well, histories of erasure and exclusion and violence on queer and trans people um, happen both by carceral technologies and algorithmic bias. It's embedded in our technologies, it's embedded in our society, and technology is a product of society. And it's part of the computing professions. It's enacted on individual people and reflected in societal biases that inform and shape public experiences of computing and technologies. So you can look at, if you're interested in sort of understanding my position on this a bit more, you can look at my my forthcoming chapter on queering computing and computing education. But to summarize, queer and trans people have always been here, and we've always been a part of computing, of technologies, the design of them, the use of them, and the queer and trans people have a long history of being at the center of developing these technologies that you use every day. But we are also erased from those histories. The examples that I have on the slide here are some of the ways that that gender normativity is embedded in technologies. So you have, for instance, full body scanners at airport security, and there's a lot of documentation around the experiences of trans people going through these scanners and being highlighted by the algorithms in these technologies as not fitting the expected gender that was put into the system, and then experiencing what some describe as emotional and physical harassment or violence as a result around their gender. So there's also automatic facial recognition software. There's a lot of controversy over this, and the harms that it can cause for a number of people, both in terms of whether it even recognizes faces. So you may have seen in the news the way that automatic facial recognition doesn't see people of color, like literally just does not recognize people of color, such as in your Zoom, but also especially women of color. But the answer to this is not necessarily to make these technologies better at recognizing and categorizing. So when it comes to recognizing and categorizing gender, what are we doing? Like, what are the assumptions that are built into these systems, and what are the harms that can come from identifying people? The last one there is gender documentation. So a lot of forms are using categorization around male, female, other. There's lots of different variations on this and the ways that it forces people into boxes, but also, you have to question, is that information even relevant? Does it need to be known? And if it does, what are the ways that people can see themselves in these documentation systems? And there's this kind of system goes back many, many years. So Mar Hicks has a historical piece documenting, looking at documentation of citizens' gender in the UK, and how the computer system could have been programmed to allow for transgender people to be recognized and afforded benefits according to their gender as it was defined, as the benefits were defined at the time according to gender. But it was, the computer was used to enforce binary gender assignments and to resist transgender people being recognized in the government systems. So that's just a bit of history about the ways that queer and trans people are affected by technologies and also we're part of it. And now I'm going to get into what are the projects that I've taken up over the last 4 years. So Creative Futures was a film and VR art documentary. And so we brought together 3 transgender youth to design their futures using VR art tools. So we were using Tilt Brush, which you might recognize there. And the short linear film follows the youth's process of trying virtual reality art for the first time and creating 3D paintings of their visions for the future based on their current life challenges as trans youth. The immersive film transports viewers inside the imaginations of each youth artist as they give a 360-degree tour of their virtual reality art and share their stories. And this was funded by TELUS Story Hive, which is, they fund media creators in Alberta and BC in Canada. And you can access both of these on YouTube to watch. So this one was a response to how mainstream media often depicts trans youth's experiences by focusing on the harsh realities of a world that excludes those who do not fit gender norms. And while raising awareness of the challenges facing trans people is important, it can also reinforce a public belief that trans kids have no future. And it's really important that trans youth, as well as society in general, see positive representations of futures for trans youth. And the creation of this documentary is informed by the belief that trans youth should be at the center of creating and sharing these stories. Because these stories shape the imaginings of what our futures can look like. And that's their futures, and they need to be a part of those conversations and not be spoken for. My next project was a virtual reality prototype. And it's a narrative project that uses multiplayer VR to explore relationships between gender, sexuality, and technology. In this one, people were invited to explore a multiplayer VR world with a friend, and together they interacted with narratives of queer and trans experiences in STEM careers, and engaged in conversations with their friend. And this one exhibited at numerous science and technology and arts festivals, events, centers, and it's not publicly available. However, it really informed future designs that you'll see next. And what was interesting about taking this work to the public is that it really, people really opened up, and we had all kinds of different people, given the varying nature of the events that we were exhibiting at. So people talked to us about their own experiences of gender and sexual normativity and the impact that had on their identities. And this is people of all identities who shared this with us. And it really, we found that the design of the space and the objects and stories that they were sort of with in these spaces, virtually with, really mattered for orienting people towards new kinds of ways of thinking, and opening up about their own emotional stories. And this sort of publicness in how we did our work is informed by the lab that I am a part of at the Werklund School of Education. It's the M3 lab. run by my supervisor and another advisor on my committee. And they started this idea of public computing. And so I sort of took that up and looked at how can we queer public computing, because queering technologies is also about queering public computing spaces. And so, for example, you have the first photo on top there is an exhibit. It's called DigiPlay, and it's located in a public walkway in the education building on the first floor at my university. And there's 3 80-inch touch screens that have simulations of a complex system that are coded using processing. And each of these simulations are what we might call hackable, because the public is invited to interact with and change the underlying code. So there's the front-facing simulation, but then you can also open up the code itself and make changes and run those changes and see what happens. And so then what started my own queering of these kinds of simulations was a fellowship at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And the second photo there is the Open Studio event where we shared the simulations, the complex simulations that we had designed during this fellowship. And this is the one that I worked on and that began at the Banff Centre. It's called Flocking QT Stories. And you can actually interact with this one if you go to flocking.queercode.org. Out of curiosity, I'm just going to see if it loads up. So if you go to projects, Flocking QT Stories, no, page crashed. So you'll have to go there yourself. I imagine this probably doesn't run JavaScript. Fine. It was a bit of an ask. So you can actually play with this one yourself. It's a multi-agent system that models emergent behavior of societal gender and sexuality-based marginalization and resilience. Emergent behaviors are new behaviors or patterns in a simulation that are not planned, but rather arise from a simple set of rules. Flocking QT Stories is a new computational representation that encourages learning about gender and sexuality-based marginalization and resilience as complex and emergent experiences. So this is based in the literature on complex systems in education, where it talks about how developing an understanding about the relationship between individual and the collective is a fundamental problem defining sociological investigation. And it involves the study of micro or individual to macro or systemic and macro to micro relationships. In complex systems, interactions between smaller or individual components of the system give rise to collective system-level behaviors that are often difficult, counterintuitive, or even impossible to predict by simply thinking about the behavior of each individual component. So this is really important for how we can start to understand the ways that that things like homophobia or racism or ableism are systemic. So they're not just an interaction between two people where someone makes a homophobic comment. It's about how these, how it's perpetuated through larger systems. And that's what this simulation is intended to sort of to represent and to help people think with. So Flocking QT Stories contains real stories of gender and sexuality-based marginalization and resilience that come from the community around Alberta. And they're based on a single moment of experience it's told as a 1 to 2 minute story. So each time you click on, I guess I didn't get to show you, let me see. Yeah, each time you click on one of the little pink triangles, it will play a story. And the simulation uses Craig Reynolds' flocking algorithm, which is designed in 1987. It's widely known in computer science for demonstrating emergent behavior. So that flocking that you see is based on Craig Reynolds' algorithm. But it reimagines it in a queer context. So each Boyd, or what's called a computational agent, Boyd is just short for droid-like, bird-like droid, that's it. These are computational agents. So they follow a set of rules about how to move in relation to its neighbor, the nearest Boyd. As the program runs, we see flocking behaviors emerge out of these interactions. And you might notice that it kind of looks a lot like how birds might flock together. And in flocking QT stories, there's normative Boyds, which are the white triangles, and there's non-normative Boyds, which are the pink triangles, and there's normative institutions, which are the white squares, and non-normative institutions, which are the pink squares. And underlying the algorithm, there's some additional algorithms that determine, or they're sort of like the set of rules of what happens to Boyds when they come into contact with, what happens to, the non-normative pink Boyds when they come into contact with normative Boyds or normative institutions or non-normative institutions. So when they come into contact or they're near the normative Boyds or the normative institutions, they lose energy. And what that looks like is they start to slow down and they start to become more transparent. And eventually, they will just stop moving altogether. If the non-normative Boyd comes into contact with another non-normative Boyd, a pink Boyd, or a non-normative institution, a pink square, then they gain energy. So they'll gain back the opacity and the energy to move that they had previously. And they are able to then join flocks again. So in some preliminary research that I have conducted with people interacting with this simulation, I found that their interactions, the participants interacted with the simulation by orienting their attention toward marginalized agents. So they would have emotional reactions towards the little pink triangles, and they'd be like, oh no, that one's getting left behind, or that one's stuck. And they'd also engage in reasoning that connected the individual behaviors of interactions with the emergent outcomes of the larger systems of marginalization that you can see happen over time. So next is Mementorium. So this is the most recent project that Queer Code has worked on. And this one, so Mementorium is a heartfelt story about identity and belonging told through a branching narrative in virtual reality. The player uncovers memories of gender and sexuality bias inside mementos that transport them to a dreamlike environment. They make story choices through playful interactions that transform their Mementorium, which is the childhood bedroom, into a place of strength and belonging. Players can shape their story and discover who can we become when we belong. And this project was an Oculus Launchpad grant recipient. If you are interested in trying it out, it was just accepted to the ACM SIGGRAPH Immersive Pavilion. And that's not been announced yet, so you're the first to know. And in Mementorium, the narrative follows one character as they reflect on memories that shaped their sense of belonging as a queer and non-binary person in STEM. Their interactions with objects progress the character's memories through time, beginning in elementary school and moving into early adulthood. The player explores each memory by choosing a narrative branch, revealing the harm caused by marginalization. Next, the player chooses the reaction to the situation using story prompts that correspond to different emotions. So things like anger, sadness, frustration. And having the player choose an emotional response creates an entry point for the player to reorient themselves to marginalized experiences. My research on flocking QT stories found that designing interactions to encourage people to reorient their attention and emotions toward marginalized experiences supports deep reflection and learning. So I sought to bring this into Mementorium by allowing for choices in emotional alignments with the character that can help the player find themselves in the narrative that they're co-creating with the character. The player's life experiences and beliefs inform their choices in how to co-construct the story. So we can't remove people's own experiences and make them feel how another person feels, this idea of walk in another person's shoes. However, we can ask them to make a story choice and align that action and feeling to the marginalized experience to support what's called perspectival thinking. So thinking from another perspective. In Mementorium, we challenge the prevailing representation of STEM as politically neutral. Such beliefs in neutrality allow for marginalized people's continued exclusion and erasure. The narrative provides one way to challenge the notion that STEM is politically neutral by sharing memories of exclusion and erasure in these environments, and our interaction design provides another way by reorienting players toward queer and trans imaginaries in STEM. So for example, in our first interaction, the narrative reflects upon the dominant cis heteropatriarchal orientation of computing and games in elementary school. The interaction that continues into the magical realm that they're transported to is reminiscent of a video arcade game with a cat knight swinging a blade. But a surprise is revealed at the end, a castle with queer and trans pride flags on it. Another game interaction demonstrates a way to queer programming with critical queer poetry written in coding languages, which orients us to another imagining of how we might interact with code. So the aim was really to take the conceptual approach and move towards more critical phenomenological approaches. So another example of this is this, what you see here, the fish, which actually is, oops, I go back. In this first GIF, you see little balls that the person grabs, and that's the initiating interaction that leads to the fish in the magical realm. So we take the conceptual approach to computing with the presumed neutral object of flocking voids, which the little orbs are using the same Reynolds algorithm of flocking to move about the room. And then we move this towards a critical phenomenological approach by asking, what is a queer or social justice orientation to the algorithm and the computational agents? So the computational agents being those circles, which now have become fish. We use the metaphor of what do you feed the fish? So your choices are based upon on what you feed them. So you grab fish food and feed them, and that's your story choice. Which this metaphor reflects this idea of what choices do you make in relation to your neighbors, and what are the emergent outcomes of those choices. And I encourage you to try playing the game to sort of reflect on that a bit further. I don't want to give too much away. So I just want to acknowledge that none of this work could happen without my co-designers, who you can see here as we're all standing in front of the Yoda fountain in San Francisco. And that's Scout Windsor on the right and John Craig on the left. And also my PhD advisory committee. So that's Dr. Pratim Sengupta, Dr. Mary Claire Shanahan, and Dr. Miwa Takeuchi. My funding sources are also varied depending on the project, but they come from TELUS Story Hive, Oculus Launchpad, Alberta Innovates, U.S. National Science Foundation, and the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And I'll just note that the opinions expressed are my own and are not endorsed by these agencies. So to finish off, a queer phenomenological approach to the design of technology and to computing education attends to the structural, socio-historical context in teaching and learning computer science and coding, and the everyday disciplining interactions with technology that shape who we can become. Thank you.
All right. Wow. Fantastic. Can we get a big round of applause for Dylan Paré? That was so good. I was taking notes and just writing things furiously down as you were talking, looking things up. That was so great.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really, really liked it. I hope it's okay. I took a bunch of snapshots of your slides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'll probably make these slides public somewhere eventually when I get to it.
Very cool. I really liked your comment on computing and games in school are all inherently biased and really on the predominant power structure, that we need to engage in this critical examination to include other lived experiences and make it inclusive so that these other perspectives can be heard. I just yeah, I love it so much. And then the use of the different algorithms there with the flocking, that was really cool. So much of it. Questions from the audience? Anyone? You can go ahead and type those in chat. Yeah, Karen says, can you explain the algorithm a bit more?
Sure. So let me just pull up something so that I can make sure that I explain it correctly, because it's easy to get lost.
Right.
Okay, so the base algorithm is Reynolds' algorithm. So this is the flocking one. And the way that one works is you have, let me see, where do I have that? Okay, so it looks, each of the boids is following a set of rules. And they're deciding these things based on their neighbor or their proximity to a nearby boid. So there's three parameters in this, or three rules, and they're about alignment, separation, and cohesion. So alignment is how the boid turns so that they're moving in the same direction as a nearby boid. And so yeah, so moving in the same direction, so a turn on the spot. Separation is how the boid will turn to avoid another boid, which gets too close. And cohesion is how the boid will move towards other nearby boids, unless another boid is too close. So how much they try to stick with the other boids around them. And in the flocking algorithm, you can adjust the values, the numerical values, for each of those three parameters, and that will determine sort of what the flocking looks like, the emergent flocking. So in flocking QT stories, there's additional algorithms that affect the way that the base flocking algorithm works. And in these, we have, like I said, there was the whether it drains or gains energy. And that's just that affects the speed and opacity. And so as they lose speed, they'll lose the ability to flock with nearby voids. As they gain speed, they'll gain the ability to flock together. And also what happens is that when you click on one of the pink voids, the non-normatives, a story, you'll hear the story play, the real life story of a person in the community. And it activates a frequency algorithm that further adjusts the way that they flock. So in the frequency, you have the higher frequency sounds. So they're separated into three sort of sections of low, medium, and high frequency. High frequency sounds will affect the cohesive motion, so how much they'll move together. And the lower frequency sounds affect separation, so how much they'll move away from each other. And the medium frequency sounds affect their alignment, so how they turn to face the same direction as neighboring voids. And the effect that this has, I really encourage you to go and try it out because I can't really show you, but the effect that it has is that when you activate a story, all of the pink voids in the simulation move together, but on their spot. They don't flock together. They sort of jitter together, and it creates this how people sort of interpret this when they're interacting with it, is that it looks like the voids are all listening together to this story.
That's pretty fascinating. Like, it's like these different rules kind of come together to create systemic effects. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Really neat. Yeah. Any other questions? I could listen to this all day. So, I mean, I had a question, Dylan. What do you think are the most, or what do you think are some of the pressing issues around these XR technologies, the virtual reality, in terms of queer tech? Do you see any new kinds of behaviors as people use virtual reality, augmented reality, or maybe some of the same old behaviors, but maybe in new ways with these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So sort of the easiest one to kind of take up around um, XR technologies and gender and sexuality is avatars and how we're represented in these spaces. Um, and I say that's the easiest one because it's the one that it's sort of our first point of contact in any new software, is how do we represent ourselves? And we go through these places where we get to set up, what does your avatar look like? And the way that those systems are designed is one of the ways that um, that assumptions around, especially gender, but just generally around body presentation, are built into these systems, and it affects how we can represent ourselves. So, for instance, and you can sort of look at this in my paper on queering virtual reality, which is available online, where we looked at how 3D sculpting and avatar design can create negative experiences of disembodiment, where society and the assumptions built into the software don't reflect you. But they also can provide spaces for digital body becoming with friends through playful exploration. So in that paper, it was a co-design study with friends, and we were working within what was Facebook Spaces, so preceding Horizons, and it was the first iteration, so there was very limited avatar options, and there was also assumptions built into the algorithms to try and do a, look at your picture from Facebook and do a quick build of the avatar and what it thinks you might want to look like based on that picture, a real life picture. And so this created very negative experiences of disembodiment, of not feeling represented, and not being able to depict an avatar in a way that that accurately reflected the way it was myself, also, so the way that I represented myself. But then, in going into Facebook Spaces, there was an option to draw new items that could then be attached to the avatars. So another one of the people in the study, one of their co-designers, drew earrings, and playfully we all kind of, were like, oh yes, I want to wear these earrings, and they also drew onto my avatar some changes that made it more personalized and reflective of my own identity. So that's one way, and I think it's a real challenge in every new VR technology, and it's an issue that goes back to any kind of virtual space. This is an issue of many, like it's been around for many years, of how are we able to represent ourselves, what kinds of body types are available, and not just around gender, but around all kinds of body shape, size, um, ethnicities, and races, how those can be reflected. Um, and even just to ask the question of, like, why do we even have to be humans? When we're opening up these virtual spaces where we could be anything, we can imagine our interactions, the spaces that we design to be anything. Why do we choose to recreate the everyday world when we can literally design anything we want? And so there's a lot of VR technologies that my friends and I, we just don't use. And primarily that's because the avatars are very limited, and they tend to be just human.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of that kind of goes in a sense to the design purpose and the assumptions that they make a priori as they say, what are we using this for? Like Verbella is designed for business and increasingly for education, and it is very kind of static in terms of your choices because they want you to use this space for so that the environment sort of melts away and that you just focus on the collaboration and the documents and whatnot. But it really, like you say, sort of um, it really delimits the possibilities, and I think in some ways um, they make a lot of those a priori design decisions in ways that unintentionally might be shutting some people who want to be represented in a different way, even if it's for that like business purpose or that educational purpose. Um, it's denying them that in a certain sense. So it's an
Yeah,
interesting balance.
yeah, and as a contrast, I'll just bring up how, like, so my friends and I, we also run a weekly live stream from VR Chat. It's called Better Together VR, and we explore the virtual worlds that that the community has created, and just talk about what are the design limitations and affordances, and what's working, what's not, what can we imagine in new ways. And we've been doing that for a year, and like, I run around most of the time as a little space dog in a Star Trek uniform.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
and my other friend is a very fancy hot dog with like different hair and clothing, and another friend is a gremlin. And the interesting thing that, like, what that has afforded is that we're able to understand different aspects of each other's personality in different ways because of those different avatars.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I back in the old days of Second Life, I became a gargoyle with albino skin,
Nice.
and that as my static sort of default avatar, because I didn't want to project the sexualized nature of a lot of
Mm,
the avatars in Second Life, and that worked as a kind of deterrent for a lot of people. um,
mm,
um, but I know exactly what you mean. Like, because I had avatars where I was a chair or a lizard, or and it was so fun to
yeah.
take on those personas and then have other people react to you in those different ways. It's
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. We're very social, and we regardless of our best intentions, we do make sort of judgments and have reactions to how people look that we're interacting with. And so, if you want to be, sometimes I want to be a bigger avatar because I don't
Yeah.
want to be like, I don't know, like most of the time I actually want to be a smaller avatar. I like being small, and that's comfortable for me. But sometimes I want to be a bigger
Yeah.
avatar and feel the kind
Yeah.
of the strength of presence in the room by being bigger.
I totally get that. Yeah. Um, so we're welcome, to continue the conversation. This is just a rich and very, very interesting conversation. But I'm going to close the main event so that our videographers can um, close the live stream. I want to thank again our videographers, Tony Cube Studios, and our YouTube audience. Thank you for listening. Please like our and share our this video. Um, I'm going to have silence for just a couple seconds and go ahead and end the recording.